Ninja Gaiden 2 is one of my favorite games of all time and easily one of my favorite character action games of all time. As much as I love Devil May Cry 3, for me, Ninja Gaiden 2 brings it home. It's the one. I am a lifelong Ninja Gaiden fanatic, and so I, like everyone else, was shocked and excited last week when Team Ninja announced that not only do they have Ninja Gaiden 4 on the way, finally, but they're also stealth releasing this new game, Ninja Gaiden 2 Black. And they are saying on the Steam page that Ninja Gaiden 2 Black is the definitive version of Ninja Gaiden 2. And so the first thing we need to talk about is, what the hell is this game? What is it? Is it a remake? Is it a remaster? To me, it's a very important distinction, because the way I judge a remake is an entirely different set of criteria to the way that I judge a remaster. And Team Ninja historically have always operated in kind of this gray zone of remaster versus remake. I mean, look at Razor's Edge. Is that a remake? Is that a remaster? But in the case of Ninja Gaiden 2 Black, it is actually quite simple. Ninja Gaiden 2 Black is a remaster of Ninja Gaiden 2 Sigma with a remade graphics engine laying on top of it. And I don't mean in an abstract coding sort of sense. I mean, as literally as it is possible in code, there is a brand new set of graphics running on top of the Sigma graphics underneath. They are down there. They are underneath the layer of Unreal Engine 5. Kind of like a tattoo sleeve that you put on your arm. The ink is not directly on the skin. The ink is on the sleeve that is over your arm. So this is a remaster with remade graphics. That would be the official classification here on the Electric Underground. And that's a very important distinction, because a remake is a brand new game. It is redoing the entire game, new code, new engine, a big investment from the developer. That would bring in a lot of other questions that remasters don't have to worry about, because with remakes, as I talked about here on the channel, they have to preserve the original gameplay, and they're judged by how much they're able to do that. Where is the places it's allowed to be more lenient? Where can things change? All that sort of stuff. Well, with a remaster, you don't have to worry about any of that. This is Ninja Gaiden 2 Sigma. The core gameplay, the core identity of the game is exactly the same. Even the speedrunning glitches still work. This is Sigma 2 underneath there. So then we can go into a more modular style of review for remasters, where for me the stakes are a lot lower on remasters, because yeah, you might get some cool extra things and cool extra graphics, but it's not the same undertaking as remaking the game entirely. The core identity is still there. An analogy that I think makes sense is a remake is if they took Blade Runner with new actors, new director, new footage, same concept and story. That's a remake. A remaster is taking Blade Runner, upscaling it, and putting it on a 4K Blu-ray. That is a remaster. However, I used the example of Blade Runner specifically because I think it matches up really nicely with Team Ninja's practice with Ninja Gaiden games, where Blade Runner has these sort of vague gray zones between remasters and remakes, where you got like the director's cut and the ultimate director's cut and the final, no, I'm really serious this time director's cut. Like there's all these various versions of Blade Runner, and you're sitting like, okay, what's the definitive version? And scholars and philosophers debate what is the definitive version of Blade Runner. That's kind of what has happened with Ninja Gaiden 2 historically, where Team Ninja have always sat in this weird gray zone with their releases, which is kind of interesting and fun in some ways, but really frustrating in other ways. It's like Ridley Scott stuff, because there are distinct different versions of Ninja Gaiden 2. There's the original Xbox 360 release, and then the later Sigma 2 release on the PlayStation 3, and that ended up getting ported to the Vita and then to the PC and modern consoles now. So the Sigma release is the release that's kind of the mainstream release we all know today, but there is the original Xbox 360 release, which is like the before special edition Star Wars VHS, I guess. It has its own distinctive fan base, its own distinctive artistic identity, And among the fans, there's just this huge debate on, which one? Is this valid? Is that valid? Are both valid? How does this work? So leave it up to Team Ninja to take a simple remaster with new graphics and make it extremely complicated. And that is why this video is going to be as extensive as it is, because I didn't want to just give you my opinion on which version I prefer. I mean, that's great and everything, but I want to give you the information and detailed analysis you need to decide for yourself. Okay, what are the differences between 360, Sigma 2, and now we have Black? Because it gets very complicated, very detailed, and I think it is a very interesting artistic discussion. But before we get into all the minutia, and trust me, it's coming, I want to take a step back and acknowledge the bigger picture here, which is no matter what version of Ninja Gaiden 2 you prefer, if you like original, Sigma 2, or the new Black version, I just want to remind the general audience out there that Ninja Gaiden 2 is an amazing, incredible game in all of its versions. And even if you strongly prefer one version of the game, if we exit the Ninja Gaiden sphere for a moment, let's just acknowledge that all versions of Ninja Gaiden 2 are like way better than all of the other stuff coming out right now. Even in Team Ninja's own library of games. You give me Ninja Gaiden 2 Black, you give me The Rise of Ronin, I'm taking Gaiden 2 Black 11 out of 10 times. I've had so much more fun playing this release than playing pretty much all other action games that I've reviewed on the channel in recent memory. It's Ninja Gaiden 2. It's that good. But there's definitely a lot more that needs to be discussed and acknowledged, so I'm not just leaving the review there. But I just wanted to remind everyone that Ninja Gaiden 2, in all its forms, is excellent and really fun and engaging. And so we're starting on a note of quality just out the gate. And so now we're going to get into the real depths of, okay, it's good, but how good? And how good compared to the rest of the releases in the series? And that's very important and needs to be discussed. And so the natural beginning point is, of course, the original version of Ninja Gaiden 2 on the Xbox 360, directed by Itagaki. Itagaki is key in this discussion because the original Ninja Gaiden 2 was his vision, and then he ended up leaving Team Ninja in an ugly breakup, and from that point forward, the original version of the game has just been stuck on the Xbox 360. There has been no official re-release of it from Team Ninja in any capacity, and no, I'm not counting emulation and that type of thing. It is just stuck. And so the fan base of Ninja Gaiden 2 are essentially the children of divorce. We're a divided household. Some side with the father, Itagaki, who's no longer around, but was super awesome and left an amazing legacy. Or some side with the mother, who's still around and she's trying to be cool and everything, but it's just not quite the same. And so that is where you get such a division in the fan base for Ninja Gaiden 2, is because the division literally is caused by the developers themselves. And I believe the reason why they have never re-released the original version of the Xbox 360 Ninja Gaiden 2 isn't just that the code is lost. That's kind of the story. Was the code lost, or was the code thrown out on the lawn and burned, Team Ninja? But I don't think that's ever going to be re-released because I think it's a little bit personal, honestly. There's more than just business happening with this division. It's like a real deep divide within Team Ninja themselves. And so I think this is an unsolvable conflict. The Parent Trap is not real. They're not getting back together. And when Team Ninja say that Ninja Gaiden 2 Black is the definitive version of the game, I do think they mean that from their perspective. Ninja Gaiden 2 Black is like our new stepdad. They're like, hey, he's kind of cool. He's kind of like your dad, right? I think that's Team Ninja's attitude here, and I don't think it's going to shift. And so the question is, how does our new dad compare, and how do we as children react to him? And yes, I'm having a lot of fun with this analogy. So anyway, in terms of game design, between original Gaiden 2 and Sigma Gaiden 2, there are three key shifts. There's tons of other little details, but there's 3 big ones. The first big one is the enemy spawn rate and the number of enemies spawned per stage. The original Ninja Gaiden 2 has way more enemies with much more aggressive spawn rates. So you're having more enemies on screen at the same time, and then the total number of enemies of the game are much higher. And also, a finer detail, but it'll come up later, is the combinations of enemies are a lot more varied in the original Gaiden 2. The second big shift between Sigma and original has to do with the enemy damage output, and that links back to the enemy spawn rate. Because since Sigma 2 has a lot less enemies on screen, they do a lot more damage per hit. So you're taking more damage from fewer enemies in Sigma Gaiden 2. They also have a bit higher health. And then the third major shift between the two is the enemy delim rate, how much you use the severance delim system, where in the original version, you delim a lot more frequently, and that makes sense because you have a lot more enemies on screen. Grouping enemies is much more of a dynamic in that release, and so the severed limb system acts a lot like a throw in a beat 'em up, where you use it to gain iframes, you use it to crowd control, you have to time it, there's a certain amount of risk, and so it's a very, very important enemy grouping mechanic in both games. But because the original version emphasizes dealing with groups of enemies a lot more, the severing system is much more key to that game's style of gameplay. Whereas in Sigma 2, because they have less enemies with more health, the delim rate is dropped, but you kind of get a more modern action game feel from this because it emphasizes comboing more, launching more, just doing damage. The game has hit stun, so thank God it's not like full-on modern action, but it feels a little bit more like a modern action game because of the reduction in delims and enemy counts. And a funny comparison that Boghog made that I'll repeat, but it's a really good one, is that playing the original Ninja Gaiden 2 is like playing the arcade version of Final Fight, and then playing Sigma 2 is like playing the SNES port of it, where there's a lot less enemies on screen and they have to break up the enemy spawns. And that's a very important gameplay distinction because it creates a whole different dynamic. In the original game, especially in the Master Ninja version of it, you are exercising crowd control. It is all about controlling these rabid hordes of enemies that are trying to overwhelm you and swarm you. That's still retained to some degree in Sigma 2, but the way they shifted the tone of the game, this is very much clear in the Master Ninja mode of the game, and it is kind of fun in its own way, I will say. But the way they sort of shift the tone of the game is you're dealing with more dangerous enemies in themselves, in small groups, and then it's like no hit challenge, where if you get hit, you're just like dead. Where that dynamic wouldn't really work in the original version, even in Master Ninja mode, because there's just too many variables happening. So the difference between original and Sigma 2 is ultimately, in terms of gameplay design, the original game is just significantly a lot more difficult, and you have to be a lot more proactive just generally, and it piles on challenges in an almost unbelievable way that no modern action game would ever come near. It stacks enemies on top of each other that are just insane, including like multiple mini bosses at once. And then as you're going through the game in the original version, you have to fight for like every inch of territory in that game. It is like a war Itagaki is raging against you, where every step forward is going to cost you blood, sweat, and tears. Itagaki is a high roller. He takes it to the table and he bets it all. And so it's a boldness of design, the original version, that you just do not get anymore. There are sections of the original game that when you're in it and you're witnessing it, you're like, why don't games ever take these kinds of risks anymore? Why is everything so safe and samey? And so it's an unforgettable experience when you play the original version of Ninja Gaiden 2, And that is why the original fans of the game are so vocal. One thing that I think would be interesting for the average gamer to consider is difficulty is content. These enemy spawns are not just some noob versus legacy player balancing decision. They are content. And if we view it that way, it makes a lot more sense. There's this really funny irony where if you talk about direct content, like, hey, this game doesn't have the costume from the previous version, and I want that costume, everyone in the game discussion space is like, valid. And it is valid. I want the costumes. But what's weird is they don't view core game design in that same way. Like, I want these insane spawns. I want to fight 500 dudes on the staircase. And it's not because I don't want newer players not to experience Ninja Gaiden and to enjoy it, but that is the content that I want. And I think if we shift this conversation away from these weird dividing lines between newer and legacy players, and instead look at all of this as content, then we're much more on track. Things are making a lot more sense. There's no reason why Team Ninja can't add in the original Master Ninja mode into Ninja Gaiden 2 Black and also have the Sigma Master mode. When you go to the difficulty selection, they could literally just put there original spawn or 360 mode like a shmup does. Shmups are great about this. There's no reason why a modern action game couldn't do this as well. There's no reason why you couldn't have these enemy spawn rates from the original version restored into the later releases of the game. And so it's just funny that an average reviewer saying, hey, they should restore the DLC mission mode into the Black version, which I agree with. They should bring those back because those are awesome. That's like universally accepted as an idea. But then the original fans saying, hey, bring back the OG version of the spawns, that's somehow elitist. And so those are the overall differences between original and Sigma. And obviously, I'm a big fan of the original version of the game, but I do not want to not give Sigma 2 its fair due in some areas that I think the original fans are a little bit unfair towards Sigma 2 about, because not every decision that Sigma 2 made was necessarily a bad one. So now we're going to talk about the things I actually like about Sigma 2, even though overall I do not think it measures up in terms of the core game. It just doesn't have enough substance there to measure up to the original version, but they did a lot with the structure of Sigma 2 that I really liked. And I think action games now could still learn from, and I'm hoping are in Ninja Gaiden 4. For example, the path sensing option, where if you hold the trigger, you will be pointed to where you need to go by the camera. That is such a fantastic mechanic that whenever I go back, even though I've pretty much memorized the game and I play the original version, I'm like, damn, I really missed that path sensing option. It's funny because in today's modern game design, it's still a very forward-thinking feature, because right now, modern developers are like, how do we help the player navigate, but we don't want to use a minimap? Oh, let's paint yellow lines on the floor and paint things yellow, even though that looks grotesque and stupid. Whereas path sensing solves both issues. There's no minimap, and you don't have to paint things on the floor. You can just use the camera. Another decision that I really liked was the inclusion of the female ninja chapters, because there's all this talk about the monotony of Ninja Gaiden, and you're just doing combat counters constantly, and it needs to have more variation and do different stuff. And the problem with a lot of that kind of talk is what you end up getting is the sort of platinum thing where it's like, oh, let's put in freaking cutscenes and mini games and all this like lame filler. Whereas with adding the female ninja chapters, you're still engaging with the core gameplay, but in a fun new way. You're playing as a new character. I think this is a great idea and honestly should have been built up on a little bit more. So rather than having just a few chapters with the girls breaking up the main campaign, I think they should have gone Resident Evil with it and had the Ryu campaign, the Ayane campaign, the Rachel campaign, and the Memoji campaign. I think it would have been cool if they had like these mini campaigns and then maybe you had a mode that mixed them all together or something like that. But the idea of breaking up the gameplay and adding new, fresh experience via additional characters, I think that is the right approach. That's the right decision, rather than, oh, let's have a section where Ryu climbs walls. Or that's where they went wrong with the original version of Ninja Gaiden 3, was exactly this problem of, hey, how do we break up the gameplay for players who want a little bit of variation? Well, of course, using different weapons, but they didn't really find a good way to hard incentivize that. So even now when I'm playing Ninja Gaiden, the campaign, I'm like, I'll use nunchucks right now. I'll use the scythe right now. There are strategic areas where you do that, but they've never been really good at forcing you, all right, now you use the nunchucks and stuff. But with shifting your character, oh, you have to use a machine gun and a hammer now because you are Rachel. There's no more dragon sword. And I really love this idea, and I think they should definitely build up on it when they do Ninja Gaiden 4. So yeah, there are great ideas with Sigma 2 that I don't want to lose. That's why it's not super clear cut of, oh, just play the original release, because there's cool stuff in Sigma 2 that I like. It's a fun time, but ultimately incomplete. And at the end of it all, that is the problem with Sigma 2 and why the original fans complain about it so much. It's not that it's a bad game in itself. It's really fun in itself, but it is incomplete. It does not have the difficulty content that the players need. You just can't have it. It's not there. It's not a question of expectations or nostalgia or old versus new or anything like that. It just does not exist. It is not there. You cannot play it. And so that is why Sigma 2 itself feels like a DLC for the original version. And that is how I've come to sort of view it over all of these years. Sigma 2's been around a long time, and the way I've sort of reconciled their relationship, and I think it helps being a shmup player because shmups have arranges, I view Sigma 2 as just an arrange for the original version of the game. And so there are times where I'm like, oh, I feel like playing the Sigma arrange of Ninja Gaiden. And so I fire up Sigma 2 and play it. But you have to basically always have both versions of the game. Sigma 2 cannot replace the original version. You just have to sort of view it as extra content. And that's how it makes the most sense. You kind of have to have both versions. Which finally brings us to Ninja Gaiden 2
Black.
And the ultimate question of the Ninja Gaiden fan base. Is this the one? Is this the return of the king? The game to unite the houses and bring all of the Ninja Gaiden players together into one ultimate release? If you read the Steam page, that is certainly what it seems to be saying. And the concept is exciting. It's a concept that Ninja Gaiden players have been waiting for a very long time. And I think that's a huge misunderstanding that I'm reading from articles about this and stuff. They seem to think that the fan base is like, okay, these are the Sigma guys, these are the OG guys, and they're just these divided camps. And every time Sigma does something, the original guys come out and be like, yeah, fuck this and all that. That's not how it works. I would say the majority of the Ninja Gaiden fans that I know are sort of wanting this. They want the two games to be united into one ultimate release so that you can have it all. You can have the additions of Sigma that are really awesome, but then have the original game represented in there as well. And if I were consulted by Team Ninja, obviously before this remaster, and they asked, all right, what do we do? That's what I would say. I'm like, all right, unite the two games. You need to have both versions in there. You have the Sigma enemy spawns for the newer players, especially with how modern that is. Most modern action game players, Souls fans and so forth, they will have a much easier time connecting with Sigma 2 than with the OG release. But let us not forget, the OG release is just sitting on an Xbox 360, and that store is down. Xbox 360s are going away. Xbox Ones and Xbox One X's, no one gives a shit about. Yes, it is emulatable in Xenia, by the way, but it's a little bit laggy. It's not that great. And we want this version of the game to be represented, to be accessible, to be a part of the conversation, not lost to time. So it is your responsibility, Team Ninja, as the mama, is even though you're mad at the ex, you've got to respect his legacy to some degree. We need to bring this divided household back together in one giant ultimate release. And so that's a big throne to step up to for Ninja Gaiden 2 Black. And the question is, does it live up to this? Is this the one? Alrighty, everyone, an insane amount of time has passed, and we've entered part 2 of this review, where we get into Ninja Gaiden 2 Black specifically. To begin with, I've been hearing descriptions of this game that sort of line up with what I've been wanting to hear and what other people were looking for, where it says it's somewhere in between Sigma 2 and the original version, and that's kind of true, but not really. So let's go over the main differences again and see where Ninja Gaiden 2 Black lines up on this. So the big one is it moving closer towards the original version's release in terms of the enemy delim rate and enemy health. And that is true in a sense, but by the tone I've heard people discuss this in reviews, it makes it seem like it's some kind of midpoint between the two. Like you take the original, you take Sigma, and then Black is right in between. And that's definitely not the case. I played all 3 versions very extensively and tested all this. And I would say Black feels much, much closer to Sigma 2. It's moving somewhat nearer to the original version in terms of the delim rate and damage. But ultimately, if you did a Pepsi challenge, you would definitely say, oh, this is like 80% Sigma 2 and like 20% of the original game. And that actually makes sense, though, because the thing that is a big difference, like I said, is the enemy spawn rate and the enemy spawns. And if you took the enemy delim and health 1-for-1 from the original and put it in Black, you wouldn't have enough meat there in terms of the enemies. You just wipe your way through the game without much resistance at all. Sigma 2 is naturally tuned towards higher enemy health and damage because of the decrease in the enemy count. That's just a fact that's going to be really hard to get away from totally. So what they could have done, and I think what a lot of people are kind of hoping they did, and I was hoping they did, they brought in a bit more of the original spawn rate to compensate and match that together, so then you could have like this perfect even point between the two. Not exactly the vision, I would say. Like I said, I would want both versions preserved, and then you could play both versions. But it's kind of a cool idea to bring them both together, and I guess you have 3 distinct modes of the game now. But that's not what happened, because when you go through and read, you know, words can be a bit deceiving. When you read about it, that's kind of the impression you get, because they talk about adding bonus enemies, adding enemy spawns. How many is additional enemy spawns ultimately? That is the question, and when you're in the thick of battle, it's very hard to tell the difference. Even if you play the games back to back, I mean, it's obvious that the original has more, but how much more? That is the question. It is a tedious question to answer, but I did it because I am that curious and it's that important to me. So I went through all 3 versions of the game and manually counted the enemy spawns through each version's stage 1. I was going to do other stages, but this was so tedious and illustrative that I'm like, all right, we're good here. And it seems to be just generally the difference grows over time. So let's take a look at stage 1, the original versus Sigma 2 versus Black. And what my findings were is that the enemy spawns between Sigma 2 and Black are nearly identical. I mean, they are basically 1-to-1. The only additional enemies that were presented in stage 1, and I did manually count these pretty carefully, you never know, but I mean, it's obvious. So the only additional enemies that really stood out in stage 1 are in the platform fight before the lunar staff. You get 4 additional claw guys, which is nice. You get 4 additional claw guys, but through the rest of the stage, it's just Sigma 2 spawns. And the only other additional enemies are these 3 already delimbed dudes just standing where you get the 1,000 lives, and then just a stray guy in the staircase where you get the fire nympho. So they did no meaningful difference there. And when you go through and do the manual counting of the original game's stage 1, the difference is very clear. And I do think it's really important for me to show these hard numbers, because without the hard numbers, it does seem very vague and a slight little thing. No, these are distinctly different enemy layouts, and it's not just about the number of enemies, it's also how you use them. Am I right, fellas? The original game's spawns are distinctive in 2 other very important ways. The first way is that it combines different enemy types together a lot more frequently, and a lot of the most challenging encounters in Ninja Gaiden are always encounters where you have a mix of enemy types, because when you have different enemy types overlapping together, they start to cover each other's weaknesses and they start to expand each other's strengths. So that is really important. And just in stage 1, the frequency of the enemy type overlap is a lot higher. So that's one key distinctive difference there that makes Sigma 2, even if they had the same quantity of enemies in the same encounter, made it a lot easier because you didn't have that enemy overlap happening. The second thing that is a huge difference between the way the original does spawns and the way Sigma 2 and Ninja Gaiden Black 2 do spawns, that's really key, is that in Ninja Gaiden Original, it spawns enemies all together in larger groups all at once. So for example, after you go on the walkway and then you jump into that skyscraper, when you come into that skyscraper in the original, you fight 5 claw guys all at the same time. Fighting 5 guys at once is significantly more dangerous and challenging than fighting 5 guys one after another, after another, after another. Remember 300? That is the case of Ninja Gaiden Original versus the Sigma and Black versions of enemy spawns. And this is across the game. It's not just in stage 1. And this effect gets bigger and bigger and bigger. It continues to diverge. It's not like they start diverged and get together. It's they start more near each other, and then as the game goes on, it gets further and further apart. The iconic example, the staircase. So the staircase encounter in Ninja Gaiden Black versus Ninja Gaiden Original is there might be additional enemies in Ninja Gaiden Black compared to Sigma 2. I did not feel like manually counting this one. It's very hard to tell by feel, but there might be additional enemies in there. It is possible. But compared to the original, there is no comparison. The original has significantly more enemies, but just as important as that, Ninja Gaiden Original spawns them in these waves together. So they'll come down in these sort of automated waves and push you up against a wall. Very beat 'em up, very shmup-like, enemy snowballing. That's what gives the encounter such kinetic effect. Whereas with both Sigma 2 and Ninja Gaiden Black, they are on these trip spawns and they come down in discrete waves that are much more contained and much easier to deal with. And so even if the enemy counts were more similar, the way that they're dispersed creates a totally different effect, because the way you do it in Black and in Sigma 2 is you just proceed up the stairs, enemy wave spawns, fight them, proceed up the stairs, enemy wave spawns. I guess you could get kind of an effect like this if you just ran all the way up the stairs and then fought everyone up at the top. You can do that. You're still not going to get nearly the same amount of enemies, but also that isn't the effect of the staircase fight, because you're choosing to create that. The thing that makes the staircase special is the game is coming at you. It's an artistic director's decision of, we're going to bury this guy with bodies. And that goes back to an interesting critique I've heard of Ninja Gaiden 2. But I think there's an interesting underlying truth with this critique, which is that they will say, oh, this game feels repetitive. It feels like you just go from encounter, sweep and clear. And that actually is true in some sense in the Sigma 2 version because of this enemy spawning problem. Because Sigma 2 so heavily segments its enemy spawns, it does start to feel like one sort of tone, one rhythm, just downbeat, 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 downbeat. There's no syncopation. Whereas with the original version of the game, and this is why if you are a bit skeptical about this, you definitely need to go back and play the original version of the game. It has much more of a dynamic rhythm because of the way it varies up the enemy spawns. That creates a flow through the stages. This is classic game design. It's not just about terrain and the way things look and going up and down stairs or through hills or swimming through water. It's how you lay out the enemy spawns and how they group together. And the more forceful the director is, the more they have a vision of how they want the stage to flow, the less it feels repetitive, the less it feels like you're just doing the same sequence over and over. And that is a problem that Ninja Gaiden 2 Sigma falls into a little bit, where because it's just constantly breaking up the encounters, they lose their identity. There is a distinct identity between an encounter where you fight 15 dudes at once and then an encounter where you fight 5 dudes in sets of 3s. But in Sigma 2, it's almost always the 5 dudes in sets of 3s, if that. You're never getting those like, holy mother of God flood moments that make the stages stand out, that make the encounter stand out, that test your endurance, that test your consistency. That is the big difference between the two. And Ninja Gaiden 2 Black follows the Sigma 2 style almost exactly. There's slight variations here and there, but not nearly enough to create that tone and character that the original game has. And then the other thing about Ninja Gaiden 2 Black that stood out to me is the way the game feels in terms of performance and input lag. When I first bought the game and fired it up, I was like, this feels chunky. This feels like a thick salsa. It does not feel nearly as snappy as the PC version of Sigma 2 or, of course, the 360 version of Ninja Gaiden 2. And the one thing that's very interesting about Ninja Gaiden 2 is the one game that actually runs the best and performs the best is the Sigma 2 version of Ninja Gaiden. Because back on the Xbox 360, that's just too much game for the 360 to handle. Though I'm kind of impressed. I played it yesterday. It does run better than I remember. But the way it works is the actual input lag and responsiveness feels great. But then when you get a bunch of enemies on screen, which starts to happen quite a bit in Master Ninja, then the game goes max pain mode and starts to slow down because the GPU and all that just cannot keep up with these enemy counts. And so what I decided to do is go ahead and lag test these if-your versions of the game and see what the results are, but under a very special condition that I recommend you all do immediately, which is that with PC ports now, especially Unreal stuff, there's a bit of software that I've been informed about by Jamers, and shoutouts to him because it's been a game changer, which is the software called Special K, and especially with its frame limiter settings. So rather than just running Ninja Gaiden 2 Black out of Steam directly, which to me just feels funky, it's chunky, inputs are getting eaten, it just feels weird and off. Run it in Special K and then make sure to put in its version of the frame limiter and its version of reflex boost and all of its settings, and it does massively improve the feel of the game. And so I went ahead and tested Ninja Gaiden 2 Black under various conditions, and I got kind of interesting results. And just a quick note, I did these lag tests with a new monitor because my old one died and burned out. And I did my best to zero in this new monitor to line up with my original lag test on my original monitor. And I think it's pretty on track here. But if it's a little bit off, by a frame or something, this is kind of new hardware here. But anyway, at least you get a clear comparison with each other. So even if the absolute numbers aren't correct, I believe the comparison to one another is, and that's kind of the point anyway. And so if you go ahead and run Ninja Gaiden 2 Black at 120 FPS, it is really responsive, which is awesome. It seems like it's responsive in 2 frames. And when I say 2 frames, I mean 2 frames of 60 frames of input lag, which is fantastic. But it's important to note that this is kind of unrealistic because in all of my playtesting, even when I dropped the settings to the lowest possible settings, I could never get a consistent 120 FPS when there were multiple enemies on screen. As soon as we got multiple enemies spawned, that frame rate really dropped. And I'm not running the most high-end hardware ever, but it's not like that terrible either. I would say it's average in terms of performance. And so I think to get a steady, consistent 120 FPS in this game with decent graphics settings, you kind of need a beast of a graphics card. So if you have one, definitely run it in 120 FPS. But if you don't, you're going to be stuck with running it at 60 FPS with the Special K frame limiter. And when you do that, it helps immensely. It takes it down from 4 frames when you're just using it straight out of Steam down to about 3 frames when you're using Special K. Sometimes it veers back into 4 frames, but it feels like a massive improvement, not just in the input lag itself, but in the smoothness and consistency of the inputs. I've heard people talking about inputs being dropped and eaten up. That definitely does seem to feel like it's happening when you're not running the Special K version. But when you are, it does help with that as well. At least from my experience. It's hard to tell scientifically, but I have played it many hours at this point. And then I went ahead and did a lag test of the Sigma 2 PC version because that version feels extremely responsive and crisp. And what's interesting is that when I run it with Special K, it also responds at 3 frames, sometimes a bit under that. But essentially, the input lag when you're using Special K between Black and Sigma aren't really all that different. But when you're playing the game, there is a definite difference in feel to it. And I almost wonder if that has to do more with the way the graphics are being rendered on top of the Sigma graphics, where maybe the collisions aren't lining up visually, even though they're lining up in code as much as they should, or that extra layer of graphical stuff happening maybe just makes everything feel a bit slippery. I've heard someone describe it as being oily. It does seem that way. There's a little bit of a weird slickness to playing the Black version, but it doesn't seem to be necessarily because of the input lag. So I guess that's good in a sense, but it does seem like the Sigma 2 version just feels more crisp and clean. So here's the results of the input lag tests. And out of curiosity, I just went ahead and tested what the OG feels like in Xenia, because that seems kind of laggy even with Special K. And that's coming out at 5 frames. That doesn't surprise me because Xenia seems to add extra input lag in all the other games I've tested for it. And, you know, if we want a really responsive, well done, well performing version of the original, at this point, I think there just needs to be a native PC port or something, because running it on emulation doesn't quite capture it. Even with an Xbox One X, you can feel the extra lag there as well. So yeah, long story short, Black doesn't seem to suffer that much from input lag, but using Special K really helps the feel of its consistency and inputs. So that brings us to the most relatable part of this video, which is discussing the missing content from Ninja Gaiden 2 Black, even from the Sigma version, but also, of course, from the 360 version. And I think everyone can get on board in saying that, yeah, Team Ninja should have put more of this stuff in. And hey, maybe they will. Who knows? This game seems to be getting a lot of popularity and attention, which tends to incentivize developers to tackle the more obvious missing content stuff. So it'll be interesting to see. But yeah, it's really missing a lot of stuff. So there's no New Game Plus mode. And then when you do the chapter challenge, there's no more online leaderboards. They aren't there for tag missions either. And there is no ninja race mode. So all of that is missing. And then Ryu himself is missing his coolest costume. He looks like Nightmare from Soul Calibur. That costume is definitely my favorite from Sigma 2, and the big missing content that I don't think most people know about is the missions DLC from the original release. Those missions are amazing and insane. I understand why they were DLC because they put a ton of work into these, and they are kind of games unto themselves, and there's some really cool stuff. So when you compare the tag missions to the DLC OG missions, there's no comparison. The tag missions are kind of easy and sort of lame, to be honest, whereas the OG missions are insane. They are gauntlets from hell. And then they even have like infinite modes with different weapons. They have some boss fights that are kind of sorely needed because there's no boss select in any of the Ninja Gaiden games. You can kind of make your own boss select. Here's another critique. You can kind of make your own boss select in the original Ninja Gaiden 2 with the manual saving points. It's kind of janky, but it is a very viable function. And for some reason, they removed that from the Sigma release historically. So Sigma doesn't have the manual save slots. And so you have Chapter Challenge, which is a mission select, which I appreciate. Chapter Challenge is awesome. But they need checkpoint select, which manual saves kind of allowed. And then another simple thing that they should do that could be patched in like a day is in the chapter challenge, they should allow you to play the ladies in the stage select and not just to their dedicated missions. They should allow you to play all of the missions with whatever character you want. I think they did this in Razor's Edge. And without it, the lady characters feel incredibly underused because they each have just one chapter to themselves, especially because Team Ninja are all proud of them and are showing them in the marketing and on the Steam page, and they're like a big marquee feature. But then when you get into the actual game, there's really not much you can do with them. And so what are my final thoughts on Ninja Gaiden 2 Black? This is kind of a complicated one because I have uncharacteristically vague feelings about it. Usually when I review games, especially action games, I have very strong, clear feelings like, yes, this is how I feel. But in the case of Ninja Gaiden 2 Black, I kind of like it. I'm kind of disappointed by it. It's kind of cool. It's kind of lame. It is a complicated game to try to really assess, maybe because I have just such a deep, soft spot for Ninja Gaiden just as a core formula. And since it retains the core feel of Ninja Gaiden, it's not like, Resident Evil 4 Remake where it's an entirely different game and it doesn't have that core. Balance and stuff aside, enemy spawns aside, Ninja Gaiden 2 Black is still Ninja Gaiden 2. It still retains that DNA. It just doesn't deliver to the fullest extent of Itagaki's vision, or I think what even Team Ninja are capable of doing. It feels unfinished. I think that's the best way to describe this release. You almost can't call it quite yet, which is weird, but welcome to the world of modern gaming, where I think what happened was Team Ninja, they did all of this excellent work on the graphics. I know some people are a bit divided on the graphics. I think they look pretty awesome, and they do a much better job of retaining the identity of the visual design of the game than normally we see with these types of remasters and so forth. So I do like the graphical style. They're definitely leaning into that sort of Neo tone visually. I don't know how exactly to describe it. Maybe it's just that's what Unreal looks like. But I could see especially like Souls fans and Neo fans really connecting with the game visually. And let's be honest, the average player is going to pay a lot more attention to this release. These Unreal Engine 5 graphics, they're the main selling point. They're what you're here for, and they kept the original direction of the game pretty much faithful. You can say some things here and there don't quite capture it. Like the city stage, it feels a little too cyberpunky for me versus the original, which has this like muted, depressed down tone rather than being spooky and cyberpunky. And then if you're wanting to play the original version of Ninja Gaiden 2, this is where a lot of the disappointment and frustration is coming from, because it's just stuck on that Xbox 360. This game did not do the legacy version of the game justice in any way. It's a revamped Sigma 2, and I'm gonna end this review on kind of an odd note, because I never do this usually with game reviews, which is I never turn to mods as some sort of sense of hope or justification, because for one, I think it's the developer's responsibility to make the game good. It's not down to modders. And as a reviewer, you could just do that with every game, right? Every game comes out, you could be like, all right, well, this game's not good, but maybe a modder in the future will fix it. So that's not a good critical standard. So this is something that I think is just going to be a weird reality of character action games these days, because I was thinking about this in terms of Devil May Cry 5 and why reviewing Devil May Cry 5 has always been so challenging for me, because every time that I talk about critiques that I have of Devil May Cry 5, every time you talk to a Devil May Cry fan, they're like, yeah, but there's a mod for that. I see what you're saying. There's actually a mod for that. Every single time. And I think that is what we're going to have to do as character action fans. And I guess as a reviewer of this genre, sort of incorporate that into the framework, because I do think that is going to be the reality of how this goes, because every force out there is always going to push developers towards making things streamlined, casual, not too challenging or crazy, because that is what game journalists push for. That's what the average Steam review push for. That's what they want. So that's an unfortunate reality, but I think the only likely path forward for the character action genre is the developers are going to essentially release the baseline version of the game with the raw material, and then it's down to the modders to go in and actually make it properly difficult and intense. I'm hoping that will be the case in future of Ninja Gaiden 2 Black. As it stands right now, it's kind of a work in progress. And so if you're curious to get into Ninja Gaiden for the first time and you think this game's graphics look engaging, it is a good game to get into the series with, but it's not the definitive full experience and probably will never truly be. I think the most likely hopeful scenario here is that modders will come in and anoint this version the definitive version and unite it. Maybe the community of hardcore players that are... They'll probably be the ones to bring it all the way home, ironically. And so if you enjoyed this review, definitely check out my Mercenaries analysis and tier list video, because that video is for the character action fans out there. Check that video out. I'm extremely proud of it. And then also, I'm probably going to continue to cover Ninja Gaiden 2 Black. That is my hope. That's what I want to do, with maybe an updated guide on how to play the game, where we get really gritty on the fundamentals and all of that good stuff. I think that would be a fun time, or, you know, whatever happens. I'm going to keep my eye on this game. I'm a huge fan of Ninja Gaiden 2, so I'll probably continue to make some videos about this release in the future. And if you can, please like, subscribe, tell all your friends, and support me on Patreon, because I am a full-time YouTuber. That is how I pay my rent and get my food and all that good stuff. And there's lots of cool extra content on the Patreon, and I'd really appreciate the support. Thanks so much. Adios, everyone.
So thank you to the $5 and $8 patrons: 100, Abdullah Suwaidi, Absconditis, Accepting Panda, Anhold, AJA, AJD578, Alistair Stevenson, Alexander Pfeiffer, Anthony A, Arcade Hell, Arrow Viper, Au Alai, Autonamed, Battle Mode, Bo, Ben Foster, Beto Dames, Bog Hog, Board Basmati, Borgie22, Brent Cox, Brian Lucy, Broseph Swagman, Captain Rhodes, Chase Palumbo, Chaflip, Christopher R, Chronic Burnout 3, Clairvoyant Bongwater, Claire Cliff, Clay Binkley, Climby Coyote, Coast, Concreted, Cooksan666, Cook Some Soup, Corio, CSP 3900, Des Audio, Dan Matei, Danchi, Darren Griffin, Dat Guy, Dave Hansen, David Aldress, David Crespo, Dididan, Demian Smirnov, Desolus, Dimension Diver, Diomke, DJ420 Praise It, Drano, Dr. Bosky, Duckies, Eduardo Quinta, Edvard, Elbin Senescence, Matsev, Elias Alonso, Empty Disco, Epson Eagle, Eric Scrivener, Eric Houdini, Esteban, Explosive General Games, Fabio, Falcus, Fenich, Fiskin, Five Sides, Florida Sucks, Forbidden Dave, Frames Per Human, Francisco, Freckle Lord, Full Set, Game Soup, Game Boy Guru, Gelhoff, Gojira Green, GPM, Gustavo Sanchez, Hawk, Hans Kowalski, Hausu, Hero Def, Unhearthy, HUD, Hugh Mungus, J-Dab, Jake Ryan, Jack Walsh, Jacob Grossman, Jacob Valenzuela, Jay McCarthy, J67, J-Lab, JBRPG, Jimmy Striggins, Jim Hans, JMD, John Kelly, John Longwalker, John Simpson, John Slaylise, Joe Saka, Josh Mayer, Julian Elwood, Jurgen, K, K2, Kane Evans, Ken10082, Kill All Music, Contain, Craze the Boys, Mangoblian, Leonard McCoy, Ludwa, Alberta, Lord Harrington, Luna Lilich, LZR Cuter, Mad Combaticus, Malaise, Mario Simic, Mark Mann, Mars Bar, Master Zeon, Matt O'Leary, Matthew Woodford, Maz, Minung, Meister, Metal Slime Drummer, Mew Jam, Michael Polito, Michael McCord, Milady, Mike Mel, Milo Shamel, Mr. Mamma Mia, Mitwid, M. Kusanagi, Morog, Monroe, Munsta Zero, Miles P, Mishkin, Nathaniel Davis, NCR Trooper Scout, Nico Pero, Neon Dagger Games, Nervous J, Ogre Mode, Okla Kugels, Oleg Talmatsev, Patrick Baseman, Paul Jablonski, Paul Osterman, Powell Perot, Peace, Pedro Isiles, Philip Plus, PLP, Poor Little Pigeon, Poorly Written Protagonist, PRK, Psycho Blizzard, Queen Charlene, Quilon Jaeger, R2 Sinus, Ralph Trujillo, Randoom, Raoul, Rapido, RC, Real Skeen, Brent Holtz Time, Retrojet, Retro Man, Retro Schmupper, Riff Mason, Rip the Jacker, Robert Chang, Rory Starks, Wolf015, Salmon Connections, Sam, Sanivo, Sarn, Scanline City, Seymour, Segfault, Shader Bunny, Shantech, Chazzy, Shmup Junkie, Sirapong, Social Kid, Spiders STG, Spongy, Steady AI, Steplable, Steve Fiction, Street Magic, Superfunk, Swoop, Synth Milk, Tamzarian, Taze Ryu, The Boot Rex, The Dirty Screech, The N1, The Old Bensta, Tom McCarthy, Tim French, TK Productions, Travis Arbon, Troop Good Guy, Sugumo, Turam, 2YU, Twest Please, Twilight EX, Tyler Olu, Unicorn Roots, Ursua, Ushi Mushi, Video Game Enjoyer, Beautiful, Vulgarity, Wabby Legs, What Is This? Your Nerdy Joe, Yosef Khalid, Zachary Patton, Zeal, and Zen Ryoku.